Good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be in Australia again. And as always, I've been here a few times and it always rains. I mean, every single time. Anyway, if I can find my presentation. Okay. Oh, it starts at the end. I have done this before, believe it or not. Where's the mouse has stopped working?
Yeah. This is the one.
Thank you. Okay, my excuse is I haven't slept. Okay, well, just to kick us off today, what I want to talk about now is really three parts of my presentation. The first one is reflect a little bit on the recent debate on, can I just change this? Am I going to do something silly? Oh, I'm going to do something silly. I won't bother, sorry. Really three parts to my presentation. The first is I want to reflect a little bit on the recent debate on how, really post-COVID, how we need to maybe do science a little bit differently if we're going to have a greater impact on policy and practice. And from that, thinking that a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit about what's happening in terms of how this is all manifest in the new operational model for the EUDA. The EUDA is the European Union's Drugs Agency, and it's the agency that's going to replace my agency, so people won't have to remember how to say EMCDDA anymore from next year. And really what we are kind of a classic boundary institution. So we work between science and practice and policy, and really what maybe some of these ideas that are coming out of the information debate are manifest in our new mandate. And then I'm going to, because that all sounds a bit boring institutional, I would just reflect a little bit, if I have time, on what that might mean for our inspector monitoring the evolution of opiate problems in the EU. So I think the first message is really a bit of flex. The world is changing profoundly. We need to keep up. And really, I think some of the ideas I'm going to be summarising in a very simplistic and top-level way, coming out of a debate that's going on with people, things like the Global Evidence Commission, some of the work the Joint Research Centre has done with their foresights work, and they're looking at how competence centres in that area, looking at how the European Commission, some of the recent work it's been doing, looking at things like how we create a better science for policy ecosystem. Some of the works that are coming out of the work we do at EU, and so that's the network of scientific agencies in the EU, and they're all generally coming up reflecting on how we might work differently. And I think there's a number of drivers for that. And the first one is it's certainly post-COVID and post-truth, really a sort of distrust of experts, and also the need to pivot rapidly to new policy and operational challenges. And we're seeing that in terms of COVID, but also in terms of things like what's happening in Ukraine. We're looking at digitalisation and a change in the global information architecture. Everybody's an expert now, so everything is true, and nothing is true, everything is possible. And that's all happening. Speed of change is getting ever more rapid. We're seeing increasingly in information overload, and rapid diffusion in knowledge and innovation, and also disinformation. And also I think there's also a number of new possibilities in terms of big data, AI, systems thinking, developments in behavioural and neuroscience. I'm going to have to, my eyesight's got terrible and I can't read my own slides. I see my own slides. If you can just give me a second. Does someone know how, so a technician, does someone know how to make the slide bigger? It's about this big. No? Okay, let me push something. Oh, yeah,
Turn you back to
there must be a way of just turning it into normal presentation mode. No. Okay. Okay, I'll plough.
There must be a full screen view, but I'm not.
I know there must be a full screen view. Is there a technician in the display settings? No, that doesn't work. Okay. I need some help here. Do we have a technician?
think they're coming down from upstairs.
Yeah, sorry about this. It's perils of getting old.
Do you want to give you the notes?
Oh, that would be perfect. Yeah, can we make it bigger? That's perfect. Sorry. Okay. All good. Okay. And now, of course. Sorry, now I've got 2 slides in the wrong order. So okay, no, okay. This isn't how I imagined this was going to go. So can you just give me a big slide and speed? So I do that?
What would you like?
I'd just like to see that slide bigger. Can I just have the mirror?
Sure.
It's all about technology I was talking about, wasn't it? Okay, I'll try again.
Okay.
That's perfect, sorry. Sorry about that. So, get back on track. So, the other thing that's happening, I think there, it's going mad. Okay. It won't go back. It only goes in one direction. Sorry.
You're right, Paul,
I know, I'm trying to get the... Can I get that? Okay. I'll use this bit, put that down. I'll try again. Okay, so it's all about also there's new possibilities. So it's things like big data, AI, systems thinking, complexity thinking, develops in its behavioural and neuroscience. And I think all that is offering us new opportunities, but you often see there being more taken up and often used by big technology companies rather than for policy development and service development. So trying to sum up this debate, this general debate that we're having, and certainly I think at international level in Europe, really what are they saying? Well, I think there's really 3 sorts of top-level ideas coming out of it. The first one is we need to be better at acknowledging complexity. So a lot of the issues we face in the drugs and the alcohol field are wickedly complex and intrinsically embedded in human behaviours and systems. And that means that really complex, systemic and dynamic social problems need equally complex, systemic and dynamic response models. And that means when we think about it a little bit, that actually, especially when you're talking to a policy audience, that multiple outcomes are important, but that interdependencies exist between these different outcomes and that they're all changing over time. And that means if you think about it, that many of the outcomes that we're interested in our area, you can think of as emergent. That means they can be sources of properties of the system itself and cannot be understood in isolation. But too often, that's what we do. We tend to look at these things in isolation. So if you think about it, if you're looking at your treatment effectiveness, you have to consider things like what's happening in your social health policy, what's happening in your mental health policy, what's happening in terms of things like homelessness and housing. So really, if we're not saying, I think, for a lot of this, that we don't need to do the kind of work we used to do, which is often looking at how cause make the effect. I think we still have to do that sort of base science. And it's not meaning that our more complex multivariate models are still relevant, they are. But increasingly we have to look at how do we apply those in the real world settings at much more greater complexity. And really, it's even more complicated than that, because we actually have to apply these in a dynamic environment where everything is constantly changing. And if you're interested how I did this slide, I have no idea this graphic was generated by ChatGPT. And here's there's a guy called James Plunkett. He's one of the policy specialists working out in the UK. And it's a quote, I know not everyone will like it, but I like this quote, which is, we spent decades thinking we were doing surgery, cleverly isolating variables, extracting value with precision, when it turns out we were doing butchery, severing networks that are vital to life. So really this idea that we've really got to embrace and understand some of this complexity, if we're going to apply the knowledge we get from our learning in real world settings to have value in terms of impacting on policy and practice. So if that's first big idea, okay, we need to be thinking a bit more about complexity and understanding complexity. The second thing is what are the implications of that? And I think it has implications both for how we collect, we generate and we communicate evidence. And the next sort of kind of consensus statement coming out of this area is that we really need to be thinking of the co-production of evidence, not something we do in science. We really need to create the conditions for collaboration, or what the in Commission's working paper there is called the science for policy ecosystem, across scientific disciplines, where policymakers practice, affected communities and people with lived experience. And increasingly we have to work more iteratively rather than linearly. We're used to kind of working in a very linear fashion, but we have to work in a more iterative fashion with an outcomes focus. So we really want to integrate learning and doing. We want to create cycles of learning. And we need to better communicate uncertainty and the limits of our evidence if we're going to have credibility. And important there that increasingly we shouldn't be talking about evidence-based policy making, but we should be evidence-informed or evidence-infused policy. But the evidence is very important to the process. It's never going to be sufficient in itself. And then we need to create multidisciplinary, agile, and a dynamic approach to garnering different methods, different types of knowledge, and recognizing different types of evidence is required at different points in the knowledge cycle. And just to give you an example, this is some work coming out of the Global Evidence Commission. And if you look at the knowledge cycle and see that as a dynamic process from problem definition, solution, options selection, solution selection, implementation issues, evaluation and monitoring, and then that leads back again into a redefinition of your problem. We need to see that as a dynamic process, and we need to recognize that different types of evidence is going to have value at different points in that cycle, and we need to collectively bring all our tools to the table and not just rely on a simple approach, a simple one-off approach. And then the third idea, I think, coming out of this, very important in the EU context at the moment, is increasing preparedness. So a few years ago, preparedness, I'm not sure even it was a word you saw, but now I think I've seen a policy document recently that doesn't have preparedness in the title. And really it's reflecting the fact that we need to provide timely data and analysis, that the evidence provider needs to keep pace with the rapid pace of change we see in the real world. It's no good having robust answers to yesterday's problems. We've increasingly got to provide answers to today's problems and even to predict what's coming in terms of future problems. And that's manifest at the EU level now. We see a lot of investment in early warning and threat assessment systems. We see that in almost every policy area. And at the same time, another strand of that has been the embracing of anticipatory science. So now that to increase resilience and preparedness, a foresight exercise is regarded a key element in any policy formation process. And we've got things like, if you see the bottom of the slide here, we've got new EU competency centres in foresight, a lot of tools and methods, a lot of them coming originally from the business world there, and regular strategic foresight reviews, an example of one of these you can see in the bottom of this slide. And we've been doing that a bit in the drugs world, and we've been working with different stakeholders, groups, in the last few years doing a futures and foresight size exercise, and we see a lot of consensus coming from that process. And really one of the things people realise that many of the important global drivers of change lie outside the drugs policy area, but may impact profoundly on it. And when we bring people together, we find things like climate change, diversifying inequalities, shifting health challenges, are kinds of things that are going to shape the problems we're going to face in the future, but things that we don't normally think about in our everyday life. So again, now bringing this sort of idea, you need both more rapid information sets, but you also need to be more future focused in the way we work. So that's me sort of briefly trying to sum up the sort of the debate that's going on post-COVID. And I want to say a little bit just how some of those things are manifest in the work that we're going to do in terms of the new EU DA that's going to replace my agency next year. And just to give you an overview of that, we started off 30 years ago with a focus on monitoring, data harmonization and standardization. So very much member states were dealing of the aftermath of the heroin epidemic, and really our work was very much about producing a common language for allowing member states to share information on what was happening in terms of the drug situation. Now we've still got that in our new regulation, it's still there, but we now also have a much greater focus on explicit role in terms of early warning risk assessment. And then there's a very wide definition of all the policy areas, drugs-related policy areas we need to work on. And just embracing a little bit of this complexity, we know out there in terms of the kinds of issues that are important to us today. And then even in case we've missed anything, any other drug-related issues and their consequence. So it's very broadly cast, the work that we've been given. And at the same time, it's not enough just to identify what the problems are. We now have an explicit role in recommending appropriate and concrete evidence-based actions, and we have to do that in an efficient and timely manner. So you see some of these ideas, I think sort of more general ideas of shaping the science framework present in our regulation. And we've got 63 million euros and 40 new staff to look at the next 4 years to do this. And just in terms of where we are now, the regulation's been adopted and will come into force in July next year. And then just to explain a little bit about how that affects our work programming. Our new work program is now built around 3 interlocking pillars. The first one is the monitoring, that we kind of our traditional work. The second one is this whole preparedness area. And the third one is competency development. And you see a little bit those reflecting some of the things, those big themes I've been talking about in terms of the more general debate in the science area. So it's more ambitious. We've got tools and means to address some of the complexity we're seeing. It's more proactive and timely. We've got a new early warning system. We've always had an early warning system for the last 15 years, so on new psychoactive substances. That's now extended to all drugs and all drug-related issues. And we've also got a new threat assessment system, which allows us to go more proactively out and rapidly investigate potential threats. There's a lot of focus on synthetic drug problems and polydrug use, and again recognizing some of the more complicated situations we face, and I'm very pleased there because we've been asking for it for a long time. There's going to be a new network of forensic and toxicological laboratories. It's much more solution focused in the phrasing of the tasks we're given, with a great emphasis on best practice and knowledge co-production. There's explicit instruction for us to engage more with civil society. It's something that wasn't in our previous regulation at all. And it's got an international perspective. We can look at threats and new challenges emerging outside the European Union because we recognise more global and joined up nature of drugs problems. Often what's happening in other parts of the world may begin impacting us, the problems we face in the future. So just to give you a little bit of the sort of underlying information model that we're building a new system on. So it's an integrated knowledge system. So we're trying to think about a little bit how we create a systemic information system to feed some of these different policy and practice needs. So really we've got our routine monitoring, and that's really what has happened. We've got fairly robust tools now. There is uncertainty, but we kind of know where the uncertainties are. It's robust, but it's not timely. We've got the early warning. It started with the new the MPS, the new psychoactive substance, but now that's extended to all drugs. So that's really what might be happening and what consequences might that have, and we have to develop different sorts of information sources and ways of working with that data. And now we've got an official, we're tasked with also conducting regular foresights and futures studies. And the important thing, these things need to all inform each other. So these different types of information need to go back into the system, because some of the things that are coming up from our future questions are going to be some of the things that we want to adapt our routine monitoring or find out more through our threat assessment and early warning systems. So if that all sounds a bit dry and boring and theoretical, I want to just reflect a little bit what it might mean in terms of what's happening in terms of opiate evaluation of opiate harm and use in the EU. And I guess I've been writing the European Drug Report for like 20 years now, and it always starts with the same the same sense as well, heroin remains a drug associated with most harm in the EU, and you see that in terms of acute poisonings, in terms of emergency room visits. We see it in a big burden in terms of our drug treatment system, and you see it in terms of drug mortality. But, and the more the buts have got bigger more recently, heroin is still important, but it's not as central as it once was if you look at the data. We have an ageing but increasingly more vulnerable population. There's very little evidence of new recruitment into heroin use as a behaviour. Prevalence of injecting is declining, it's declining quite dramatically, and also when we've started doing some new work, and one thing that surprised me recently, when we look at syringe residues, for example, what we see is a much greater diversity of substances being injected, and actually increasingly stimulants playing quite an important role in some of the harms that we're seeing related to this behaviour. And here's a bit, and it kind of shocked me the first time I was looking at it. Only in a minority of countries is heroin most commonly associated with opioid deaths anymore. So overall, probably, in terms of absolute numbers with the big countries, probably heroin's still the most important opioid, but at the national level, it's only in 5 countries is the opioid most associated with opioid mortality or overall mortality. And against that background, we're seeing the drugs used in opiate agonist treatment and pain medicines more visible in the data, and really be wondering a little bit how that's new for us. How do we respond to that? How do we message? What are the implications of that? And we're seeing increasing signals of use and harm caused by new synthetic opioids. So how does that work in terms of responding to complexity, in terms of monitoring opioid mortality? I think some of the implications that we're thinking about and talking about at the moment is we really need to adapt a surveillance approach designed for heroin. We developed this approach 30 years ago, and very much in trying to tease out and isolate heroin within the sort of noise of data we have. But it's no longer fit for purpose in a world where we're really interested in some of the context of the complex polydrug consumption patterns we're seeing today. So really our tools just are not fit to purpose, and especially for all things like medicinal products. We need to improve our forensic and toxicological information sources. Really, if you're going to look at multiple drugs, it's essential to have better forensic and toxicological data, and we really don't. We need to improve the extent our contextual understanding of overdose events, and really quite, I think the CDC in America have been doing really interesting work. They've got good tox data, they've got the registry data, but they're also doing forensic audit. They're looking at the context in which mortality occurs, and then they're bringing that understanding together. We need to increase our surveillance of non-ferret use of opiate pain medication. This is the big elephant in the room for us for a long time. And we need to actually also think about evidence literacy with our stakeholders, because some of these changes that we're seeing could be misinterpreted. They could be misinterpreted in very damaging ways, especially around some of what we're seeing, in fact, in terms of the opioids used for drug treatment and some of the payments, where they're appearing in the data, but in some ways you can see that as almost a positive thing of 20 years of policies that have targeted heroin as a main problem. So we need to explain that to our stakeholders in ways that the information available is not misunderstood with adverse consequences. So just to show you a little bit of data to back up some of these things, our toxicology is not great, but it's getting better. This is just opiate deaths, heroin deaths where we have good toxicological information. And what you see here is very, very few deaths do we find heroin alone. So really what we call heroin deaths are generally polydrug use deaths, and mostly they involve now that big green medicine. Mostly that medicine is a street benzodiazepine, but we're really not picking that up or understanding the implications of that in our monitoring and what does that mean for our response models. Similarly, here's just some other toxicological data just showing on fatal heroin overdoses, and it shows that there's a lot of information in some countries, there's an awful lot of diversity, and there's also probably contextual changes over time that we need to understand better. So if you look at the first graph in the top corner, that's an Eastern European country, and essentially there we get a register. We know how many drug overdose deaths there are, but we know very little about actually the drugs involved in terms of toxicology. There's simply no information. The next one is a Southern European country, and what you see there, heroin is important in the deaths, but it's actually not is slightly less important in terms of methadone. We have a lot of now cocaine appearing in the data set. These are all the drugs found in all the toxin on overall drug overdose deaths within the country. And we're also seeing increasing benzodiazepines very present. And the last, at the bottom of the slide, the next thing is a northern European country. And there you see actually buprenorphine is the most common opiate involved in drug-related death cases. We see heroin is virtually absent from the data at all. We see things like pregabalin and tramadol in there too. And again, we see the benzodiazepines. So again, we need to respond and reflect a little bit, understand this complexity in overdose mortality. And then just the last thing is from a Western, the table in the bottom of the slide is from a Western European country. I'm just showing that over the last 10 years, the context of drug-related deaths has changed dramatically, especially in terms of the gender balance and in terms of the number of overdose deaths that are occurring within the homeless population. So that's the routine monitoring. Let me say a little bit about threat assessment and early warning. So all that data is from 2021. What we've been seeing in 2022 and this year is we're seeing the emergence of the nitrazines. So these highly potent opioids coming on the back after the fentanyls. We're still seeing a little bit of fentanyls. From the last day, we have about 150 fentanyl deaths in Europe a year. So not very small in terms of our overall number of drug-related deaths, but it's there as a background thing. We've seen some production. That's a picture of a carfentanil production lab in a Baltic country detected earlier this year. But what we've seen after, I think, is this emergence of deaths and the deaths and detections of these new nitrazines, often appearing sometimes sold as heroin, sometimes sold here as pictures and sold as oxycodone tablets, and appearing in a number of countries and actually driving a dramatic increase in drug-related deaths in some countries, and also now being picked up in countries like the UK, not in our system anymore, where a number of deaths that originally were attributed to heroin, now it looks like nitrazines are playing a role there. So what are this new emergent signals of these drugs? So what are the implications of that? Well, the first thing, I think we're seeing new opioids and we're seeing new opioid forms. So we're seeing mixtures with things like xylazine, with benzodiazepines. So why are these appearing in the market? Who are they appealing to? And what's the context of that? So we need to find out more about that. What we're seeing is the market's changing really rapidly. Our monitoring system doesn't keep up with this. So there's a need there for rapid risk assessment and sharing of knowledge. We need to understand a lot of the toxicological issues associated with the drugs. They're more potent than fentanyl, but they work in different ways. So we can't assume our current understanding, even what we thought we understood about fentanyl, necessarily applies to these new substances. There's policy implications, simply the fact that they're not controlled in many countries. There's implications for harm reduction and risk awareness. We have an issue that naloxone opioid antagonists don't work in the same way, and we have to think about the delivery methods, those with reflecting the different toxicology of these substances. And we also have to think about, often they're appearing in forms that they might be consumed by opiate-naive individuals who may be unaware that they're actually consuming a potent opiate. So how do we respond to that? These are new challenges for how we think. And then we've got to reflect back on that. How does that impact what we're going to do in terms of the early war, in terms of our surveillance system? Because for many countries, until they haven't got the capacity to detect these new drugs, and we need to build that back into our routine monitoring so we can actually start reflecting and know something about the scale and over time the developments in this area. And if that's early warning, what if we stand back from that and think a little bit about what might be the implications in terms of foresights and preparedness? Here's some data. This is pictures from Afghanistan. This is satellite imagery. And what we've seen in Afghanistan, all the heroin in Europe comes from Afghanistan, more or less. And what we're seeing is the Taliban has instituted last year a ban on heroin production. So one of the questions takes usually about 18 months for opium growing in Afghanistan to feed into the European drug market. So we're predicting that we could possibly be seeing a heroin shortage middle of next year to the end of next year. Interestingly, a number of countries are already picking up on signals that heroin, there might be changes in heroin availability already, and we're wondering if we're already seeing some impact of that or if that's just noise in the system. But if you think about that, what does that mean from a futures and preparedness perspective? Well, I think the first thing is really when we don't know if this is going to happen, but we really need to be thinking about what are the future possible scenarios and how do they form the policy and operational choices we make now. So what could be the things we should do now to make us more resilient to this these possible changes. We know from the past that opiate epidemics have been generational. So you've seen this generational nature if we look back in the past experience we've had in Europe. We know from the experiences in North America that consumption patterns in terms of opiate problems can change very, very rapidly with profound implications for public health. We have previous EU experience that in the short term droughts can have a long-term impact on consumption patterns. So we had a drought going back in 1921, which impacted profoundly on the opiate problems after that, particularly in the Baltic region. So we saw the introduction of fentanyl in some countries that continued once the heroin supply had come back into the market. We know that links exist between organised crime groups involved in synthetic drug production in the EU and Mexican groups involved in fentanyl production in the Americas. And we know also that we have a lot of capacity in some previous evidence of synthetic opiate production within the EU, but not a lot going on at the moment. And we also, I think we can postulate that new forms and some of these new delivery technologies that we're seeing emerging, some of these new drugs and the forms they're appearing in vapes, they're appearing in nasal sprays, could prove attractive to younger age cohorts who may not be interested in the sort of conventional heroin use we've seen in the past. So when you put that all together, we begin to think, what are the implications for that for the early warning system, for our routine monitoring? And we're looking at very important things now that we're establishing. How do we look at whether we are going to see drug flows from Afghanistan, heroin flows, the market disrupted, and particularly looking at how can we start putting into place measures to detect the possible increased use of synthetic opioids, and particularly how we need to look in groups, younger age cohorts that may not be in our normal monitoring. I've been told to finish, which luckily I can now. So really, again, that was just trying to give you some of the ideas how this new system with this a more integrated and more dynamic information model can be reflected in a substantive area like opiate problems in the EU. And so ironically and finally, I think I only had one simple point to this presentation, and it's illustrated in this slide. Thank you very much.